Hey there, welcome to day 14. In this one, we're going to be creating a web application using two separate frameworks, and then we're going to make it accessible to the internet, and then we're going to go ahead and run scheduled jobs or workflows with all of those things. Now, the challenge that I want to solve here is I want to make it easy for me to run my web scraping events that we did in day 12. I want that to be accessible to the internet too, because perhaps I want this to run on a Raspberry Pi or just a machine I don't use that often. So the idea here is that we have this running through the internet. Now, what we're going to be doing specifically is we're going to be using Flask and FastAPI to create local running web servers. This is the Flask one. This is the FastAPI one. And then we're going to be using something called ngrok to give us a live URL, just like this. And after all of that, we're going to be using a service that I created for this specific reason to trigger that ngrok endpoint, to actually call that endpoint at a specific interval. And in this case, it's going to be every hour. Now, the reason for this has to do, going back to what I was saying, is to get that webhook data that we already had. Right? So before I got that data 2020 from the boxofficemojo.com. But what I want is I want this data updated on a regular basis. In my case, I want it updated every hour. And of course, you don't want to do it manually. Manually would take way too long. So we do it on a schedule and all of that. And then we also log that data. So of course, this is what the code's going to look like at the end. I try to make it as cross-platform as possible. And the other thing about this, the reason I'm using both Flask and FastAPI is they are micro frameworks. They make it really easy to create a web application with very little Python. I'm just going to show you what both of them look like right now before we actually jump in to doing it from scratch. So right here is the Flask version, right? So look at that. That is a web application right there. I have multiple URL endpoints here, as we see. And then if we want to look at the FastAPI one, there's the FastAPI one. Not a whole lot different. Of course, we're going to talk about this stuff a lot more in detail in just a moment, but the idea is that building a web application is not really that complicated. It can start to get complicated when you want to do more robust things than just calling a couple functions. But in our case, calling a couple functions is all we really need to do. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so to get started, let's go ahead and create our day 14 folder. And inside of here, I'm going to make a index.html file. So I'm making a poorly formatted HTML file. So we'll just say h1 hello world. So I want to illustrate a point here. So we save this and let's just go ahead and open this up. I'm going to reveal it in the Finder window here and just double click and open it. It should open up in your web browser. If it doesn't, just make sure you do that. Notice the URL up here, it's just referencing a file and it's saying hello world. That's cool and all, but what if I wanted Python to actually run it? So going back into VS Code, let's go ahead and make sure that we're in our project here. So if I list everything out, let me go ahead and cd into day 14. And now we can use something that's built into Python. It's Python 3-m, and that is http.server. And if I hit enter, I get this as a response. So what this is saying to me is really simple. It's saying that it's serving on http://localhost:8000. It's serving something there. Now, if localhost for some reason is not working on yours, there's a really good chance that it is. But if it's not, just use 127. Let me write it out. 0.0.1. Those are the two URLs that essentially are your local host or your local server. And that's true across every machine, unless for some reason your IT department changed it. But by default, this is what it's going to look like. So with this still running, I'm going to go ahead and go into localhost 8000 and refresh in there. What do you know? I've got hello world. Of course, it's the exact same thing as that file. And if I save it with these new URLs and refresh, what do you know? It shows up both times. The major difference here is, of course, this is actually a server. It's actually running as a web server, where this is just opening up the file and it happens to open up in Chrome. Now, if you changed where HTML files opened, it might open up in VS Code and not even go anywhere. Okay, so what we want to do is actually turn this concept into our own Python project, right? So instead of using the HTTP server, we're going to use another way to do that. And instead of a index.html file, we're going to be using Python to send back what we want our web server to show us. So the first thing that we need to do is create a virtual environment. Now I go into a lot more depth on the installations that I discussed in day one. So I'm not going to go into that much depth here, but just keep in mind that what we're going to do is very important for versioning. Whenever software changes, a new version comes out and you want to keep those version things intact. So I also want to do that. Now, part of the reason you're watching this might be because of Python version 3.8, right? Not 4.0. Maybe 4.0. 4.0 might have a lot of the things that you'll still learn from, but in general, you're probably watching this because of Python 3.8. Now, other Python packages aren't a whole lot different. So let's go ahead and close out this server with Control C. And I'm going to go ahead and do Python 3-m pip install pipenv. That's pipenv, just like that. So pipenv is a virtual environment manager. It makes it really, really easy for me to create and manage virtual environments across multiple systems. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. I'm just going to clear everything out in the terminal. Again, make sure I'm inside of where index.html is, or more specifically, I'm in the day 14 folder here. So I'm going to go ahead and run pipenv shell and then -- python 3.8, right? So the reason I'm calling 3.8 is I want to make sure that I'm using Python 3.8. And if you can call Python 3.8 on your system, in other words, if you can type out Python 3.8 like that, then you should see Python 3.8 or whatever the latest version of Python 3.8 that your system has. So if you're on Windows, you probably don't even need to declare this because there's a good chance that you already have Python 3.8, but you can also put your path to it, something like that. That is, I'm pretty sure that's how I showed you how to set it up. But even if it's not, you just want to make sure that you declare the version that you're using, and we hit enter. Now that we've got that, it's going to create something called a pip file here, and this is going to reference all of our packages and just our general environment setup. So I'll go ahead and do pipenv install the things that I need, which in this case, it's going to be Flask, gunicorn, uvicorn, and FastAPI. Okay, so those are 4 different packages that we're using. Now, Flask itself is the micro framework that we're going to start with, and then FastAPI is the micro framework we're going to end with. Both are, well, they're both really good, and they're almost identical. There are some differences that I'm not going to get into here, but they're both really good. And the reason I'm not using something like Django is because it's a lot more setup to do this, in case you were wondering. So gunicorn and uvicorn are the things that actually run this in a similar fashion than what we did with that Python-m HTTP server, right? So we'll see what that looks like in just a moment. So what I'm going to do is actually set up my server.py. So inside of here, I'm going to do, let's call it server 1 because I'm using 2 different frameworks here. So server 1 is going to be our Flask server. First thing I need to do is import the Flask class. So from Flask, import Flask. Yeah, right. So Flask is the package name, and then capital F is the class. Then we declare an application, typically known as app. Then you initialize it with the Flask class, right? Or instantiate an instance of the Flask class if you want to get really technical. And then we're going to go ahead and declare what's called a route. Actually, before we do that, let's go ahead and declare a function here. Simple function, we'll call it hello world. And it's going to return just a string of hello world. This is Flask. Okay. So what we can do with this is a function, obviously a very simple function. But of course, I can actually run other code here if I wanted to. And that's actually something we do want to do, just not yet. So I'm going to go ahead and run the @app.route, and then whatever route that I want to use, and then also declare the methods that I want to accept. In this case, I'll say get. Okay, so what is this route thing here? Like this actual path right here. Well, remember back when I did this index.html here, I have this local host, And on that local host, if I just ran it as default, it would go to the root of that web page, which is just /. If I wanted to go to ABC, that is a different route or route, then I would go ahead and say ABC, right? That's it. You just want to make sure that whatever you want this to look like has to match this right here. Everything else doesn't matter, but those do. Okay, so I'm going to leave it in at the index of this page. This is what it's called whenever there's not a path or like something past this trailing slash. If there's anything past that, it's not the index page. Just having a slash is the index page. Okay, cool. So another thing, one slight thing that you want to also know is that if I copy this and paste underneath here, this actually won't work. This runs an error because you need to have unique function names. So let's go ahead and just call this ABC underscore view and then just say ABC here. And now that will work. Okay, so now our virtual environment has the things that we need installed, right? So it has Flask, it has gunicorn. These are the two things we need for Flask to run. These are the two things we need for FastAPI to run. So the Flask server, so server.1, I just want to just double check my environment by doing pip freeze, and it shows me all of the things that are installed here. Let's just open this up a little bit. And we see that Flask is in there and gunicorn. Great. So the next thing, of course, is I want to make sure that I actually have, that was an accident. Let's go back in there and pipenv shell. And yes, that's an easy way to reactivate it if you accidentally did what I just did. So what we want to do is make sure that gunicorn, if I can type out gunicorn and, gunicorn. Oh yeah, that's the actual error I want, not something like that, right? So that's the error you don't want, even if you're on Windows. Same thing. Either way, you want to make sure that you see gunicorn in here. And uvicorn is also another one, very similar. It's going to have something like this. You need to actually declare the application. So it's saying no application module there. So how we declare this application module has to do with where we actually store the place of where we call app from Flask. This is also true for FastAPI, so it's not really a whole lot different there. So what I need to do here is I need to run gunicorn, and then the name of the module I did, which in my case is server1, and then colon, and then the app name. So in my case, I called it app, but if you called it application, you would just come down here and call this application. And you would also want to call this one application as well, but I want to leave it in as app. Let's go ahead and save that and hit enter here. And we see that it started gunicorn and it's listening at this URL, right? So no surprise there. It also does not say localhost. It says the other one. So you can hit command and click or control and click, and what do you know? Hello world, this is Flask. And if I went to that other one, which I think I called it ABC, it also says hello world, this is Flask. What if I change it to just hello world, this is ABC? Hit save, and I try to refresh, nothing happens, so I need to just reboot this server. So I hit Control C and then run that again, refresh, and now it's saying this is ABC and this is Flask. Cool. So we now have a way to actually run an actual server. So what we can do here is, yet again, run some other code, right? So like some sort of web scraping event or something like that. We did it in day 12, so scrape.py, we could probably run this again or import that run call and actually run that from our server. Now to do that, I would want to bring that code in and all that. But before I even get there, what I want to do is create server 2. I want to show you how to do this exact same thing using FastAPI instead of just Flask. So inside of day 14, we'll make a new file here, server2.py, and this one is, well, it's not a whole lot different. So you'll see from FastAPI, import FastAPI, app equals to just FastAPI, like that. Notice how I capitalize things, and also realize that the documentation for both of these things is readily available, and it's, I mean, they show you how to do the exact same thing. Just keep that in mind. Look at that. Look at that. Okay, so back into it. Again, I'm going to go ahead and create a function here, and I'm going to call this hello world, and I want to return something. Now with FastAPI, with an API in general, you want to return a dictionary. A Python dictionary turns into a JavaScript object, which is also known as JSON, JavaScript Object Notation. So we want to say hello and world. Okay. So the difference between Flask and FastAPI at this point is how it actually goes about doing things. FastAPI is meant to be an API. It's not meant to be a web server in the sense that Flask is. Although they both can do both things, that's the point. Out of the box, FastAPI returns JSON. Out of the box, Flask returns HTML. That's it. Okay. So with that, let's go ahead and say the decorator of app. So again, the @ sign and then app. And yet again, how this is named, it has to do with what we did right here. And this time we actually declare the method that we want on here and then the route. So we don't call route, you just do .app.get. Again, the documentation would show you how to do all this if you are so inclined. And yet again, if I wanted to change this to something different, I can say ABC. And again, I would change the function name to ABC view. And then I can say hello. And let's do 1, 2, 3, something like that. Okay. Or rather data 1, 2, 3, right? Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and close out of this web server for Flask. Now I'm going to go ahead and use uvicorn. And this time it's server2 : app. We hit enter. Shows us this URL. No surprise there. We hit command click to open it up. There we go. There is FastAPI running with uvicorn. Now, if we actually go back into VS Code, I can see every time I request a page, so I'm reloading it constantly here, it actually shows me some data about that request. It shows me the path that I'm requesting. So if I go into ABC, it will show me ABC there. Cool, so now we have 2 different web application frameworks that I can run at any time. So I actually want to create a shortcut to making sure I do know how to run them. And I'll go ahead and make a new file here. And we're going to call this run1.sh. And then we'll make another one called run2.sh. And if you are on Windows, you'll say run1.ps1. Okay. So, or PS2. Actually, I'll put both of them in there. This is actually really easy to do. It's just rewriting the command. So run2.ps1. Okay. So run 1, well, what did we do? We ran gunicorn. So it's gunicorn. And it was server1 :app. Okay. Save that. And this will also go in PS1 in my case. So I'm putting it for all users here. And then run 2 was running server2. And this one was uvicorn. And that's server2 -app. And there we go. Okay. So I close this out. And for us Mac and Linux users, we have to do chomod +x run1.sh, and then the same thing for 2. This just allows us to execute it from our command line. And if you're on a Windows, you would be using PowerShell, so /run1.sh, and of course PS1 if you're on PowerShell. Hit enter, and you should be able to run either server that way. Just a quick little shortcut of doing that. So we don't have to remember that command is kind of the point. Okay, so now that I've got this, yet again, I can check and make sure that, hey, look, that's Flask is running now versus the other one. Okay, so what I want to do is, since I have a way to run these servers locally, I want to actually have them accessible by the internet. So there's a few different ways to do this, but one of the ways is deploying it to a web host of some kind. Right, so you can actually deploy it on a live server, get a domain name, and do all these cool things to it. But that takes a lot of time. It's not super complex. It's not really that hard, but it does take a lot of time to actually do it. And especially if you've never done it before, it might be really challenging. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to use something called ngrok. Now, the reason I use ngrok is because it allows me to put a URL to one of my local hosts, one of my local running systems. Right? If I turn off that local running system, that URL still exists, but it's no longer accessible. So it's a very secure way to do this, and a lot of really big companies do it because it's really easy to do, as we'll see in just a moment. So after I set this part up, then what I'm going to do is set up on Invictify a trigger that will actually call that specific URL at an interval that I want, right? And these two things combined will allow me to run scheduled jobs on a regular basis, like a job that's going to run our web scraping thing. Now, there's certainly other ways to do both of those things, like I said, but it takes a lot more setup process than what we'll need to do here. All right, now we're going to go ahead and install ngrok onto our local system. Now, if you're on Windows, go to this timestamp right here. That will show you how to do it. It's roughly identical. So let's go ahead and go to ngrok.com, and you're going to want to sign up for an account. Once you sign up, this is what you'll see, something like this. And you're going to want to download the version for your system. So once you download it, then all we need to do is unzip it. And then we add in our auth token, so we have a little bit more robust ngrok usage. But now that mine's downloaded, I go into my download folder here. I'm just going to drag it into my dev folder. I typically keep it in my dev folder there. And of course, if you don't know how to get to your dev folder from the Finder window, you can always use open on any directory, and that will bring you there. Okay. So back into my dev folder, you need to just unzip this file here. I'm actually going to call this ngrok.zip. And you can unzip it on the command line, or you can just double click right here and it'll unzip where you have it. Okay. So now I'm going to go ahead and navigate into there. So we'll go into cd dev, and then I'm going to do /ngrok. And there you go. So I can actually run ngrok here. We'll do that in just a second. But before I do that, I want to actually set my auth token here. So back into ngrok.com, I'm going to go ahead and grab this token and come back into the terminal. There we go. So now I've got my ngrok token set up. So the next thing I want to do is actually set up an alias. So let's go ahead and clear this out. I do pwd. I see exactly where I am, and I'll list things out. I see ngrok's in here. I also have ngrok.zip. That's okay. So the alias is going to actually allow me to just type out ngrok anywhere on my machine, and it will run that exact same thing like we did with /ngrok. Okay. So again, clear it out. Now, if you're on bash, you would do sudo nano ~bash rc for this exact same command. It's exactly the same. It's just a different file. For us, we're going to do z shell. And then I already have a few aliases in here. Depending on if you followed along with me, you would have these as well. So I'm just going to call it alias ngrok, and then I'm going to set it equal to that path. So in my case, it was users, and I believe CFE, dev, and then ngrok. Now hit Control X, Y, enter to save. And now I can do source. And then now I can run ngrok anywhere on my machine, as long as I don't move that actual configuration, this right here. If I move it, then it's not going to be able to call that. Now, of course, with ngrok.com open, we're going to go ahead and download the Windows client here. And I'm going to let it download. It takes a few minutes. And then once it's downloaded, I'll open up the File Explorer in my downloads and grab that ngrok and bring it over to my dev folder. This is where I like keeping this file. Of course, I want to rename it to just ngrok. You don't have to do that, but I like doing it to know for sure that that's what it is. And then I unzip it with the file program called 7-zip right in this particular folder here. And now I've got ngrok going. So next thing, I need to open up PowerShell and actually navigate into this dev folder. So real simple, we'll list everything out, make sure we are in the root of our user. We'll cd into the dev folder, and then in there we'll just do /ngrok and then .exe. And that's how you'll run it on your Windows computer all the time. You'll navigate to the dev folder, run ./ngrok.exe. All right, so now what I'm going to do is go ahead and call and run ngrok. Of course, if I just type out ngrok, it gives me all of these examples. Now, the main example that we want is ngrok HTTP and then whatever port that we want. This will give us our web server. So if I actually run ngrok, and of course, you Windows users, you have to use the path to the executable, the .exe one, ngrok HTTP, and then the port that I want to use. So if I said 8000, this will give me an 8000 port. Now keep in mind, if you actually didn't activate your account or connect it, this right here, you would see that it would time out after like 8 hours, I think it is. So of course we want to actually make sure that we don't have it timed out. That's why I activated that account, and I'm on a free plan still. So I can actually go to one of these URLs here and take a look. So if I open up that URL, I get a failed to complete tunnel connection. No big surprise here. I don't actually have my server running. Now in your case, you might still have your server running because we've been doing a bunch of things in the terminal. Now I can leave the terminal open for this if I am so inclined to actually test this specific project out on a regular basis. So going back into VS Code, I can open the terminal window up. Now I want you Windows and Mac users to consider closing out your terminal and then reopening it, just in case that there's some sort of memory or caching issue with actually running ngrok. So I'll go ahead and list these out, and we'll cd into day 14, and then we'll go ahead and do pipenv shell, and then I'm going to go ahead and run. First I'll do run.sh, run1.sh, and again, we note that it's running at 127.0.0.1, 8000. Now that is also the local host, so you can replace 127.0.0.1 with localhost, the word, and we got that port here of 8000. So that actually has to correspond with the port that we're using on ngrok itself. So when we did that command, we have to actually run that, right? So this has to match this with the exception of localhost. Okay, so now that I've got that running, let's go ahead and take a look at that URL again. And what do you know? It's actually now serving this web application on the internet, even though it's on my local system. Now, I wouldn't recommend that you do this for a lot of users, right? If you're wanting to actually have a real website with a real URL, this is definitely not the method. But for what we're doing, it's great. It allows us to do all sorts of really cool things in our project here. So the other part is if I close this out and let's say I run the second one, I can just flip back and now, hey, what do you know? I got the second one going. And of course, I have to have ngrok running in order for that to work. If I close out ngrok with Control-C, it stops, and then I try to go back to that URL and refresh. It's saying the tunnel's not found, right? So, once again, run it again, it opens up a different tunnel. Right, so that URL is not that reliable, or whatever tunnel that I was originally using is not that reliable in the sense that we can absolutely change it. It's not going to be consistent URL. I would imagine if you upgraded your ngrok account, you can start to designate specific URLs for that to actually work. And I mean, hey, if you like ngrok, you might as well support it and actually get a plan itself because it can be worth it in many cases. So now that we've got ngrok working, I actually have a URL that I can run and use with all sorts of things, right? So before I actually start using it, I actually want to have my servers actually run some sort of function. But the general idea here is with ngrok, if I ever need to test anything on a local web application, I can run that web application and then run ngrok based off of whatever it is that I'm trying to do with that web application, and just keeping in mind that we are using the correct port. So one more step on this whole thing I then want to do is I just want to make reference to the actual ports that I'm using. So using run1, so in gunicorn it's .bind, and then it's 127.0.0.1, and then 8000. So what that's going to do is actually bind it to the port of 8000 at localhost. But if I actually changed it to like 888, which you totally can, you can see that it does change right there. And then my ngrok, close that out, I would just change that to 888. Right? And the reason you would do something like this, as in changing the port itself, has to do with the fact that you might have other projects on your system that you want to run. You want to run the local host. Let's say, for instance, you had another Flask application you wanted to run, or another FastAPI one. You would want to change the consistently running ngrok account to something different, right? Because I can leave this on all the time. I don't actually have to turn it off. It only turns off when my system turns off. So that's pretty cool too. So the next thing is run2 uvicorn. I believe it's just port 888 like that. I still have ngrok running, so I don't need to worry about that. Make sure I save run 2. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and put this into PS1 as well for all of these things. I know it'd be really nice if gunicorn I could just say what port, but you have to bind the entire address there. So let's go ahead and try run 2. And what do you know? It's showing me the port. Okay, cool. So yet again, I still have ngrok running. I go back into Chrome, and this is the incorrect URL here. All right, so I gotta change that URL. And there you go. Sweet. So that is ngrok. In day 12, we introduced the idea of web scraping and actually being able to do web scraping on a regular basis. So now what we're going to do is bring that into our current server environment and actually run it using ngrok. So I'll also use Python requests as well to actually make a call to whatever ngrok endpoint that we're end up using, because we want to see what this does in action. So I'm going to grab the code from cfe.sh/github and looking for the 30 days of Python repo. Inside of there, the tutorial reference, and day 12, I'm going to go off of this. Now, of course, if you already have this locally, you don't have to do this. But for those of you who are only watching this video or re-referencing this, this is going to be an easy way to grab our web scraper. So I'm going to go ahead and go to raw, and I'm just going to save this file with Command S, and I'll navigate into my dev folder, into my 30 days of Python, day 14, and I'll just save it like that. Okay, so going back into our project, we should now have scrape.py in here. So I'm going to go ahead and close things out a little bit and just make sure that I have a way to actually run our scraper. And sure enough, I do. I also had some arguments in here that I allowed for. I'm going to go ahead and cut those out and also get rid of the name main function. I don't need to run this ever by itself, so I'm going to use our servers to do that. And I'll just call in the run itself and just always go off of whatever this year is. That way this year is very up to date as this thing is running. That's kind of the point, is just to make sure our current data for this year is constantly being updated. All the previous years you could do in other ways as well. Okay, so now that I've got that, what I need to do is actually import this into both or either of my servers. So I'm going to go ahead and do from scrape, the actual module itself, and then we're going to go ahead and import run. And I'll call it as scrape runner, just so that if I ever need to import or use another function called run, I don't have to, rename it or change it. This is a simple and easy way to change any of those functions or classes if you need to as you import them. So that's pretty cool. So with this, I'm going to go ahead and make a new route. I'm going to copy the hello world route and paste it underneath here. And of course, I know that I'm in Flask just by app.route. But of course, I'm in the Flask one because we see it up here, if that wasn't painfully obvious already. And I'm going to call this scraper. And we'll call this the scraper view. It might be better to actually call it the box office mojo scraper. Like actually give it a much more descriptive URL itself, which is what it is. So it actually scrapes boxofficemojo.com, and then we'll just go ahead and run that in here. And the method I'll use is post, literally only the post method, right? So this is going to allow me to run this, and then I'll return true or done or something like that. So let's go ahead and just say done. Okay, great. So for a moment, let's leave it as Git, and let's go ahead and run the server. The reason I'm leaving it as Git is just to make sure I can just test it locally real quick. Notice I don't have a module name Python requests. Now that's coming from scrape.py. If I scroll to the top, I've got a number of requirements in here that I need to install. So pipenv install requests, pandas, and requests-html. We hit enter. Now, I already know these off the top of my head, but also you can infer a lot of times the name of the install from what's being imported, right? So the import is often the same name as the pipenv install or pip install. It's not always the same, but sometimes it is. And of course, the real way to find that one out is if I were to watch the video itself or to actually search, pip install something like this, pip install requests HTML. So that same import, and then I'll probably see the request.html PyPI link here, and there it is, right? So that same link would be used instead of using the pip install. You would just add .env, and that would install that package onto our local project. So of course I need those installations to happen in my virtual environment because my virtual environment didn't know about them, for one, and then number two, if I actually want to run that function, of course I need to install the packages that it uses, right? Which I think makes a lot of sense. Okay, so now it has finished installing. I'm going to go ahead and run that again. So run one. This time I don't have errors. I'm still on port 8888. Let's go ahead and open that up. And then again, it was box. Well, let's actually just copy and paste the URL there. So in server one, we called it box office mojo scraper. So there's the path that we need. I hit enter and I get a server error. Okay. So I get a undefined error. I think I left the scrape.py with a challenge, and it looks like I didn't actually uncomment everything out. So I think it's this right here. I'm just going off of memory here, so bear with me just a moment. Okay, let's try that again, and there it goes. So it looks like it ran it. Now, if we go back into our project, notice I now have a new directory in here called 2020, and this is actually giving me all of that exact data. Okay, so that's cool. So that's actually going through our local host, right? But what we want to do is go through ngrok. But before I do that, let's go ahead and make sure that our other server has that same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and close out the terminal. And yet again, I'll go ahead and do from scrape import run as scrape runner. And I'll copy this here and paste underneath. And this time I'm going to do post again. And let's go ahead and grab that same path that we had before here. So box office mojo scraper. Okay, there we go. And then I'm going to go ahead and run this scraper inside of this view. And I'll just call this the scrape runner view like that. All right, so the return data is just that. That's what we'll leave it in as. And again, I'm using post. I want to use post method on all of these. So I'll change Flask to also using post. So now if I go back into Flask with it still running, I might have to actually restart the server. So let's go ahead and restart it. Now it's giving me a method not allowed. Okay, so that's to be expected. All right, so let's go ahead and make sure ngrok's still running. In my case, it is, and it's running at this URL here. So I'll go ahead and post that there, or put that in here. Hello world's working. Next thing is we want to grab that path again. And I get the exact same error, method not allowed. To be expected, right? So the method not allowed is how we set it up. We want to use a post method. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use requests to trigger this. So inside of day 14, we'll make a new file here, and I'll just call this trigger.py. And I'm going to import requests, and the endpoint being that. Right, so we actually want to use the ngrok URL first. I'm going to just grab whatever that base URL is, because that does change. So I'll come in like that. In fact, I'll leave the trailing slash out. Okay, so let's make sure that that's the trailing slash. And then I'll go ahead and just run r equals to request.post to the endpoint. The JSON data in my case is empty. And then I'll just go ahead and print out r.txt. We'll save that. Now I have to leave my server running. I have to leave ngrok running in order for all this to work. So back into VS Code, I'm going to make a new terminal window here and navigate into my project. Let's just make sure I'm there. Still in day 14, that's great. So pipenv shell, and then let's go ahead and run just python trigger.py. Again, being in a virtual environment, I don't have to type out Python 3 out here. So python trigger.py, This should work. Let's go ahead and hit enter. And it sends back done. Now, the reason I did r.text is because of how I have my server set up. I have my server setting up to return HTTP or an HTML response, right? It's not a JSON response. So what that means then is I can try out server 2 and see what that data is. So let's close out the running server. I'm going to close this Explorer here. And I'm going to now run run2.sh or PS1 if you're on Windows. Let's just verify I'm on the right port, the local host and all that. I'm just going to press up on trigger. And this time I actually get JSON data back. Now, it only printed out the TXT, but I can actually infer or know that it is JSON data. And I can say something like this, right? I know that it's that. There are ways to test that are automatic, but I'm not going to do that right now. I'm just going to run this and actually test out that I'm actually getting JSON data back. And then requests turns that data back into a Python dictionary so I can call the key value pairs in here, which is pretty cool. So that's actually working now. So I do want to go one step further though, is on server 1, the scrape runner, I'm going to also send back a dictionary. So I'll go ahead and say done and 1, 2, 3, something like that, right? So now I can use Flask in the same manner, right? So if you return back a dictionary, Flask will automatically run back with that same thing. Oops, I called it data, not done. So let's call it data here. Restart Flask and run that as well. So yeah, both of them, FastAPI and Flask, can return JSON back just like this. This is a very simple and easy way to turn the Flask API into, or rather turn a Flask project into its own REST API. Cool little hint that I did not go over yet, which is a huge benefit to keep watching, right? So now that we've got that, we actually have a live URL, we have a way to scrape this data, and we have a way to return data. Now in my case, I'm doing this locally, so I don't need the data returned. I just need this file updated. And so to keep this updated, we need to run this scraper on a regular job. Like I can keep this server running, I can keep ngrok running, and then all I need to do is actually call the endpoint on a regular basis using a service that allows for me to do that. And that's actually what Invictify will allow us to do, is to actually run this on a regular basis so that we can have this file updated and updated locally. Of course, the path as to where this file exists could be on something like Dropbox or Google Drive. It doesn't actually matter where the path of this file is. What's important here is that 1, we can scrape in the first place, actually run that. 2, we can actually make a web server. And then 3, use ngrok to actually turn it into a live local web server. And then 4, finally using Invictify to actually scrape it on a regular basis. Now that we have our routes set up and have an endpoint, an actual live URL that we can use through ngrok, what I want to do is accept what's called a webhook. So a webhook is one software application talking to another software application and sending some data there, right? So what I want to do is actually trigger this post call here. I want to actually run that scraper, and I want to do it on a schedule by handling a webhook. So to do this, of course, we're going to be using invictify.com. I created this project specifically to solve this challenge for beginners. I think it's a really useful way to get things going. There's a free tier, but even after you get a little bit more advanced, you're probably going to want to use this as well because it just sends scheduled webhooks whenever you need. You can also do some other things with it that are pretty cool, but I'm not going to get into that. All you want to do is sign up for a free account on invictify.com, and then you'll jump into something like this. Now, again, we have our ngrok server going, so just double checking that. Here's my ngrok server. This is the endpoint that I need to use here in conjunction with what we did on the requests trigger, right? So this whole thing right here, I need to actually add in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this URL here. I'm going to go on Invictify, add the base of it, and then I'm going to grab the box office Mojo scraper endpoint, and I'm going to scrape this every hour. Okay, so now that we have this trigger, after a short delay, it will start to actually run every single hour. It will do the scraping every single hour until you turn this trigger off, which is a really critical piece of Invictify, is allows you to actually run scheduled webhooks on a regular basis. And you can do it based off of hours, like intervals like this, or cron tabs, or you can have it respond to signals, which is a little bit more advanced. But the general idea is now I can actually run these triggers and run any kind of workflow that I need as long as I have ngrok working. And of course, the more advanced things that you could do here is, well, number one, if you don't want to use ngrok, you can stop using ngrok and deploy it to a live production server. Number two, if you don't want to use Invictify, you can use something like Celery and Redis to actually handle all of those transactions yourself. So those are other ways and more advanced features that you can definitely set up. But I created Invictify to make it really easy for you or really any developer to run webhooks on a regular schedule without too much overhead. I mean, I thought that was pretty easy to set up. Hopefully you did as well. Now, the main thing here is I do want to actually see the results of this. So I'm actually going to go ahead and let this run and I'll let it finish. But you also want to just check what the timestamps are. So every once in a while, you would actually consider inside of this scraping view, I might say like, oh, well, I want to actually make sure that this is actually being triggered and it's actually hitting my endpoint on a regular basis. I realize that there is going to be some sort of log inside of Invictify, or maybe now you realize that, but you also want to just double check to make sure that Invictify is doing what it should be doing, because we just should do that. That's a nice thing to do. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to import OS and I'm going to import date time, and I'm going to create a new file here. Actually, let's go ahead and put this in its own module. So inside of day 14, so that the reason I'm putting this in its own module is so that I can use it on either server. And I'll just go and call it the logger. So logger.py. And all this is going to do is we're going to import OS and import date time. All this is going to do is create a new folder or a new file like data, but it's going to be called logger. Okay, so inside of scrape.py, I'll go to the very top. I'm going to grab this same thing of base directory and back into my logger here. And then I'll call it logdir, and we'll go ahead and do os path.join, and that's basedir and logdir, or sorry, rather logs. And then we'll do os.makeDirs and logdir exist okay equals to true. And all I'm going to do here is save, or let's go ahead and do trigger log save. And I'll just go ahead and give a file name equaling to the date time object. So we'll do date time.now, or rather .datetime.now. And then I'll go ahead and say with, or let's do a file path and then do os path.join, and we'll do logdir and the file name. Oh yes, and I want to actually just call this a txt file. And I'll just go ahead and say with open file path w plus as f, and then I'll just do f.write some empty string, and then that's that. Okay, so now that I've got this, I'm going to go into each server and go ahead and do from logger import trigger log save. And I'm going to put this in my scrape runner view here. Save that one. And I'll put it into server 1 as well. So from logger import trigger log save. Go ahead and copy that and paste that down here as well. Okay. So now whenever that endpoint's called, it should actually run that. So we can run this again. And it looks like I got an error here. Let's see why. Oh, I kind of messed up on that F string there. Oops. Let's go back into that logger and put the curly bracket there. There we go. So let's run that again. So now it's running, and of course I can verify that this will actually work by running python trigger.py. And what we should see is inside of logs, I see a file actually there and that data coming through. I'm going to go ahead and delete these things because I want to have this actually come through from Invictify and ngrok, not just my local running. So now with it running, I'm going to leave this recorded, and then what we'll see is actually the events happen in Invictify, but we'll also see the actual updated logs and all the data inside of VS Code as well. All right, there we go. We have a successful event inside of Invictify. We can see this by a code of 200. Any status code in the 200 range is considered a successful event. And you can see the endpoint that it used, right? That's probably fairly obvious because the trigger's endpoint is the same. And then it also sends back that same data that we asked for in our local server. So that's pretty nice. Now, of course, the things about this is if ngrok is down or the server is down, you're going to get a different status code. And Invictify will automatically turn off this trigger if the status code is incorrect or a bad error status code. Anything other than in the 200s, essentially, it's eventually going to turn off this trigger. So if we go into VS Code, we can double check this stuff. We got our 2020 CSV in there, and then the log file that happened when this was actually triggered. And this, of course, is going off of my local date and time, where this one is going to be going off of a UTC date time object. So no matter where you are in the world, this is using UTC. So that's what you'll see. Now, the thing about this too that we have to realize is we need to make sure that our server is running. So whatever that server is running, we need to make sure it's running locally. And then of course we need to keep ngrok open and running as well. And it will give you something along the lines of, if you don't have an account there, it will say that it's going to turn off after 8 hours. So that's another thing to think about as well. And of course, this whole process doesn't have to be web scraping. We can do anything in here. So let's say, for instance, we wanted to send a follow-up email to customers on a regular basis, like every other day or something like that. You could totally do that with everything we have here. We just need to change what any given endpoint does, right? So back into our server, we would just need to change what happens in here, or that workflow, if you will, of what's going on. In this case, the workflow is doing two things. It's triggering a log, right? So it's saving that file, and then it's also triggering the web scraper. But we can add as many functions as we want in here, including, let's say, sending it somewhere else, or uploading this data to another server, or sending it to your customer as well as an attachment. You know, there's all sorts of really cool things that you can now do with some of this knowledge. Now, the things that you can make it a little bit more robust is, number one, you would turn this into a live server. You would put it on your own server that you're paying for, not using ngrok, and not worrying about whether or not it's running, because it would run all the time then, right? So you wouldn't have to worry about if ngrok is running if you were on a live production server. Now, in lieu of using something like Invictify, you would use a service called Celery. So Python Celery, celeryproject.org, you would use something like this. That's actually what Invictify is based off of, is Celery. So it's running things on a schedule and events. And you would use a task queue called Redis. Now, all of that stuff starts to get a lot more complicated, and maybe needlessly complicated because of what we just did. But it really depends on the things that your project absolutely needs. But now you should feel confident that, hey, you've built your first web application, you've made it accessible to the internet, and you've made it also handle webhooks. There's a number of things that actually went on here, even if it didn't feel like it. So hopefully all of this makes sense. And of course, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching day 14, and we'll see you next time.